Hey everyone, tonight we begin with something that will completely shatter everything you think you know about education. Picture this, you're complaining about your 8 a.m. lecture or that pop quiz in calculus, but what if I told you that medieval students faced educational challenges so brutal, so psychologically devastating, that they would make modern academic stress look like a gentle massage? We're talking about a world where getting beaten with a rod was considered essential pedagogy, where students as young as 7 were shipped off to monasteries to memorize Latin texts they couldn't understand, and where the very concept of childhood as we know it simply didn't exist. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1347, and 7-year-old Thomas has just been delivered to the monastery school at Canterbury. Like a sack of grain, his parents aren't cruel, they're actually doing what they believe is best for him. In medieval society, formal education is exclusively the domain of the church, and if you want your son to have any chance of rising above the mud and animal dung of peasant life, this is literally his only shot. But Thomas doesn't understand any of this. All he knows is that yesterday he was playing with wooden toys carved by his father, and today he's standing in a stone corridor that echoes with every footstep, surrounded by boys who speak in hushed Latin phrases he's never heard before. His father, William the Miller, had saved for 3 years to afford the monastery's entrance fee, a sum equivalent to half his annual income. The family had eaten nothing but barley porridge and cabbage soup for months to scrape together enough silver coins. William's hands shook as he handed over the precious money to Brother Francis, the monastery's treasurer, knowing that this investment might be the difference between his son spending his life covered in flour dust like himself, or perhaps one day wearing the fine robes of a clerk in some lord's household. The irony wasn't lost on William that he was illiterate himself, unable to even sign his own name, yet here he was betting everything on the power of letters and words he could never understand. The monastery school at Canterbury houses about 40 boys ranging in age from 7 to 16, and the hierarchy among them is more rigid and brutal than anything you'd find in a modern prison. Thomas quickly learns that survival depends on understanding this invisible but absolute social structure. At the bottom are the oblates, boys like himself whose parents have essentially donated them to the monastery permanently. These children will never leave, never marry, never have any life outside these stone walls. They're considered the property of the church, and their training is designed to break any connection to the outside world. Above the oblates are the paying students, sons of merchants and minor nobility, who will eventually return to secular life, but need Latin literacy for their future careers. These boys enjoy slightly better food, warmer clothing, and protection from the worst physical punishments. At the top of the hierarchy are the novices, older teenagers who have chosen monastic life and are being groomed for eventual priesthood. They serve as enforcers of discipline among the younger boys, wielding almost unlimited power with the full backing of the adult monks. Brother Marcus, the schoolmaster, is a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the kind of permanent scowl that comes from spending decades trying to drum Latin grammar into the heads of unwilling children. He's actually one of the more enlightened educators of his time. He only beats students for major infractions rather than minor mistakes. His predecessor, Brother Augustine, was known to break wooden rods across students' backs with such frequency that the monastery's carpenter complained about the expense of constant replacements. Marcus believes in psychological rather than purely physical punishment, which makes him almost progressive by 14th century standards. The daily schedule would horrify modern parents and probably violate several international conventions on children's rights. Thomas wakes at 4 a.m. to the sound of a bell that seems to ring directly inside his skull. The dormitory is so cold that his breath forms clouds in the air, and the straw mattress beneath him is damp with condensation and crawling with insects he's learned not to think about too carefully. He has exactly 3 minutes to dress in the dark. There are no candles wasted on student convenience. Before stumbling to the chapel for matins, the first of 7 daily prayer services that punctuate every aspect of monastery life. The chapel service lasts an hour and consists of chanted Latin prayers that Thomas doesn't understand but must memorize perfectly. Brother Marcus walks among the boys during prayers, listening for mistakes in pronunciation or signs of inattention. A mispronounced syllable earns a sharp blow to the back of the head. Nodding off during the lengthy recitations results in being forced to stand through the entire next service. Thomas has learned to sleep with his eyes open, a skill that will serve him well throughout his educational career. After morning prayers comes the first meal of the day, a bowl of thin porridge made from whatever grain is cheapest, usually barley or oats, that have been stored so long they taste more like dust than food. There's no sugar, no milk, no seasoning of any kind. The boys eat in complete silence while one of the older students reads aloud from scripture in Latin. The reading serves a dual purpose. It reinforces religious instruction while ensuring that no one enjoys their food enough to linger over it. Thomas has learned to eat quickly without tasting, swallowing the grey mush before his taste buds can register its complete lack of flavour. The schoolroom itself is a testament to medieval priorities. It's a long, narrow chamber with high windows designed to let in light but not warmth. The walls are bare stone, and the only decoration is a large wooden crucifix that seems to glare down at the students with wooden disapproval. There are no desks. Boys sit on hard wooden benches with no back support, hunched over pieces of slate or precious scraps of parchment. The lucky few who show promise are occasionally allowed to use actual paper, but most of Thomas's early education consists of scratching letters into wax tablets that can be smoothed over and reused. Writing implements are almost more valuable than the knowledge they use to record. Each student is given a single reed pen that must last for months, and ink is carefully rationed like liquid gold. Boys learn to write in tiny, cramped letters to conserve materials, developing a script so small that modern readers would need magnifying glasses to decipher it. The ink itself is made from oak galls, iron, and wine. When wine is available, and has a tendency to fade or turn brown over time, adding an element of impermanence to everything they write. The curriculum is mind-numbingly narrow and repetitive. Thomas will spend his first 2 years learning the alphabet and basic letter recognition, not in English but in Latin. He's not allowed to learn to read his native language because vernacular literacy is considered dangerous. It might give him access to ideas and stories that haven't been approved by the church. Every text he encounters is religious in nature, from simple prayers to complex theological treatises that would challenge university scholars. The assumption is that if you can read the most difficult Latin theological texts, you can read anything. But if you can only read simple vernacular stories, you might develop a taste for entertainment over enlightenment. Grammar instruction is a particular form of torture that makes modern language learning look like a delightful game. Thomas must memorize hundreds of Latin conjugations, declensions, and grammatical rules through pure repetition. There are no mnemonics, no visual aids, no attempt to make the material interesting or relevant. Brother Marcus simply recites long lists of verb forms, and the students chant them back in unison until they're burned into memory through sheer repetition. A typical grammar lesson might involve chanting amo, amaz, amat, amamus, amatis, amat for 30 minutes straight, followed by amabam, amabus, amabut for another 30 minutes, until the boys' voices are hoarse and their minds numb. Mathematics exists, but barely. Thomas learns basic arithmetic using Roman numerals, which is like trying to do algebra with poetry. Simple addition problems become exercises in frustration when you're working with symbols like MCMLX7 instead of normal numbers. Multiplication is almost impossible, and division requires computational tricks that would make a modern calculator weep. The boys learn to use an abacus for more complex calculations, but even that requires memorizing dozens of different counting methods, depending on the type of problem. Most mathematical instruction focuses on calculating religious feast days, determining the proper dates for Easter, and figuring out how much grain the monastery needs to buy for the coming year. The few subjects that might actually be interesting are taught in the most boring way possible. History consists entirely of memorizing lists of biblical genealogies and the dates of various saints' martyrdoms. Geography is limited to the Holy Land and the locations of important Christian sites. Natural philosophy, what we might call science, is strictly forbidden as potentially heretical. Any curiosity about how the natural world actually works is redirected toward religious contemplation of God's mysterious ways. Physical education consists of manual labor disguised as character building. Thomas spends hours each day copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, a task that might sound scholarly but is actually brutal physical work. Medieval copying requires perfect penmanship, maintained for hours at a time in uncomfortable positions. The boys hunch over their work tables, their backs aching, their fingers cramped, their eyes straining in poor light. A single mistake means starting the entire page over, and the cost of ruined parchment is deducted from their already meagre food rations. The scriptorium work reveals the true economics of medieval education. The monastery doesn't educate boys out of charitable kindness. It's running a profitable business. The manuscripts that students copy are sold to churches, nobles, and other institutions that need written records. The boys provide free labor while paying for the privilege, making the school incredibly profitable for the monastery. Thomas is simultaneously customer and product, paying to be trained as a worker who will generate revenue for his educators. Discipline in the school goes far beyond simple corporal punishment. Brother Marcus has developed an elaborate system of psychological warfare designed to break down individual identity and rebuild students as obedient servants of the church. Boys who show signs of homesickness are publicly mocked and forced to write long confessions of their weakness. Students who ask too many questions are labeled as prideful and given extra religious instruction designed to humble them. Any display of creativity or independent thinking is treated as a dangerous sin that must be corrected through prayer, fasting, and additional manual labor. The older students, particularly the novices, serve as a secondary layer of control that's even more brutal than adult supervision. 15-year-old Brother Jerome, a novice with dead eyes and a talent for finding weakness, takes particular pleasure in tormenting the younger boys. He's learned that the adults approve of students who help maintain discipline, so he's developed increasingly creative methods of psychological torture that look like spiritual guidance to casual observers. Jerome forces Thomas to confess imaginary sins, assigns him additional prayers for non-existent infractions, and creates elaborate theological tests designed to demonstrate the younger boy's ignorance and unworthiness. The social dynamics among the students create additional layers of misery. Boys form alliances based on shared suffering, but these relationships are constantly undermined by the competitive nature of the system. Academic success is a zero-sum game where one student's advancement often comes at another's expense. Thomas learns to hide any signs of understanding or ability, because appearing too smart makes you a target for both jealous peers and adults who see intellectual pride as a spiritual flaw needing correction. Food becomes an obsession and a weapon in this environment. The boys are kept deliberately hungry because medieval educators believe that physical discomfort sharpens mental focus and builds spiritual discipline. Meals are barely adequate even by medieval standards, consisting mainly of thin porridge, coarse bread, and occasionally some cheese that's more mold than dairy. Students learn to eat everything put in front of them regardless of taste or apparent freshness, and hoarding food becomes a survival skill. Thomas discovers that he can trade his expertise in Latin pronunciation for extra bread crusts, creating a black market economy based on academic abilities. The seasonal rhythms of monastery life add their own challenges to the educational experience. Winter is particularly brutal, with no heating in the dormitories or schoolrooms. Students wear their outdoor cloaks indoors, and ink frequently freezes solid during morning lessons. Thomas learns to warm his writing hand under his armpit between sentences, and several of his classmates develop chilblains from the constant cold. The short winter days mean that most lessons take place by candlelight, which is expensive and dim, leading to frequent eye strain and headaches. Spring brings different challenges as the monastery's agricultural work intensifies. Students are expected to help with planting, weeding, and eventually harvesting, adding hours of physical labor to their already demanding academic schedule. The work is presented as spiritual discipline, but it's really about the monastery's economic needs. Thomas learns that education is never separate from economic reality. His Latin lessons are valuable precisely because they will make him useful to employers who need literate clerks and administrators. Summer heat makes the stone buildings unbearable, and the lack of proper sanitation becomes even more apparent when temperatures rise. The shared dormitories smell like a combination of unwashed bodies, rotting straw, and human waste that isn't always successfully contained in the designated areas. Disease spreads rapidly through the close quarters, and Thomas watches several younger boys sicken and die from illnesses that would be easily treatable with modern medicine. Death becomes so routine that it barely interrupts the daily schedule. Morning prayers continue, even when someone died in the night, and lessons proceed while bodies are carried out for burial. The psychological impact of this environment cannot be overstated. Thomas is 7 years old when he arrives, still young enough to cry for his mother at night. By age 10, he's learned to suppress all emotional expression as dangerous weakness. The system systematically destroys children's natural curiosity, creativity, and emotional development in favor of producing obedient, fearful adults who will never question authority or think independently. The few students who maintain any spark of individuality do so by hiding it so completely that they risk losing themselves entirely. Religious instruction dominates every aspect of education, but it's religion as social control rather than spiritual exploration. Students memorize vast quantities of Latin prayers and biblical passages without any discussion of meaning or personal relevance. Theology is presented as a series of absolute truths that must be accepted without question, and any attempt to understand or interpret religious teachings is discouraged as presumptuous. Thomas learns that his job is not to understand God, but to obey the men who claim to speak for God. The monastery's library, which should be a treasure trove of knowledge, is largely off-limits to students. The few books they're allowed to see contain the same religious texts they memorize in class. Secular literature, classical philosophy, mathematical treatises, and anything that might stimulate curiosity about the natural world are kept locked away from young minds that might be corrupted by exposure to unapproved ideas. Thomas occasionally glimpses other books when older monks are reading, but he's taught that curiosity about forbidden knowledge is itself a sin requiring confession and penance. Assessment and advancement in this system bear no resemblance to modern educational measurement. There are no grades, no standardized tests, no clear indication of progress or achievement. Success is measured entirely by conformity and obedience, with academic ability being almost secondary to spiritual submission. A brilliant student who asks too many questions will be held back or punished, while a mediocre student who demonstrates perfect obedience will be advanced. The system rewards those who can suppress their intelligence and creativity in favor of mindless compliance. By age 12, Thomas has survived 5 years of this system and has been fundamentally changed by the experience. He can read and write Latin fluently, recite hours of religious text from memory, and perform complex copying tasks with beautiful penmanship. But he's also developed the dead-eyed compliance of someone whose spirit has been systematically broken. He no longer asks questions, no longer shows curiosity about the world around him, and has learned to find safety in absolute conformity to authority. He's been successfully educated according to medieval standards, which means he's been transformed from a naturally curious child into a perfectly obedient servant. The few students who go on to university face even greater challenges. University life in the medieval period makes modern college look like a luxury resort. Students as young as 14 are sent to cities like Oxford or Paris with minimal supervision and expected to fend for themselves while pursuing advanced studies that make monastery school look simple by comparison. They live in overcrowded boarding houses with no heat, limited food, and constant violence between different groups of students representing various regions and social classes. Academic life at medieval universities is dominated by formal debates conducted entirely in Latin, where students are expected to argue complex theological and philosophical points according to rigid rules of logic. These debates often turn physical, and it's not uncommon for scholarly disagreements to be settled with fists, knives, or even swords. The drinking culture among university students makes modern fraternity parties look like polite tea ceremonies, and the combination of alcohol, weapons, and academic competition creates an environment where death by violence is a regular occurrence. The university curriculum is even more restrictive than monastery school, focusing almost entirely on theology, law, and medicine, as understood through medieval religious frameworks. Natural philosophy exists, but is heavily constrained by religious doctrine, and any conclusions that contradict church teachings are forbidden regardless of observational evidence. Students learn to argue brilliantly within very narrow parameters, developing intellectual skills that are impressive but ultimately limited by the requirement that all conclusions support predetermined religious truths. Thomas, if he's fortunate enough and psychologically resilient enough to survive the monastery school and advance to university, will spend another 6 to 8 years in this environment. He'll emerge with advanced degrees in theology or law, fluent in Latin and possibly Greek, capable of complex logical argumentation, and completely prepared for a career in church administration or royal bureaucracy. He'll also be psychologically scarred, socially stunted, emotionally repressed, and completely unprepared for independent thinking or creative problem solving. The irony of medieval education is that it succeeded brilliantly at its intended purpose, while failing catastrophically at what we would consider education today. The system was designed to produce obedient clergy and administrators who would maintain existing social and religious structures without question. It accomplished this goal with ruthless efficiency, creating generations of highly literate, well-trained servants of authority who possessed advanced technical skills but had been systematically trained never to use those skills for innovation, criticism, or independent thought. Modern students complaining about homework loads, standardized testing pressure, or authoritarian teachers have no comprehension of how fortunate they are to be educated within a system that still recognizes them as individual human beings with rights, needs, and potential for growth. Even the most rigid modern educational environment operates within frameworks of child development, individual learning differences, and basic human dignity that would have been incomprehensible to medieval educators. The worst modern teacher is still constrained by legal, professional, and social expectations that protect students from the kind of systematic abuse that was considered essential to medieval education. Modern students may face stress, but they don't face daily beatings, deliberate starvation, sleep deprivation, social isolation, and psychological warfare designed to break their spirits and remake them according to external specifications. Perhaps most importantly, modern education, for all its flaws, still aims to develop critical thinking, creativity, and independent problem-solving abilities. Medieval education aimed to eliminate these qualities as dangerous threats to social stability and religious orthodoxy. Modern students are encouraged to question, explore, and think for themselves within appropriate boundaries. Medieval students were taught that questioning itself was sinful pride, requiring correction through punishment and prayer. So the next time you're struggling with a difficult assignment, stressed about exams, or frustrated with educational requirements that seem pointless, remember Thomas and his fellow medieval students. Remember that your freedom to learn, to question, to make mistakes without facing physical punishment, and to develop your own ideas and interests represents a kind of educational liberation that would have seemed impossible to young people who lived their entire educational careers under the constant threat of violence, humiliation, and spiritual condemnation. Your education may be imperfect, but it still treats you as a human being worthy of growth and development, rather than raw material to be hammered into a predetermined shape through years of systematic brutality. The year is 1384, and William the baker is already awake at 2 a.m, not because he's an early bird or particularly motivated, but because if he doesn't have fresh bread ready when the market bell rings at dawn, he'll face a fine that could wipe out a week's profit. More terrifyingly, he might lose his license to bake entirely, a death sentence in a world where your trade guild membership is literally the difference between survival and starvation. But here's what no one tells you about medieval baking. It wasn't some charming cottage industry with flour-dusted aprons and warm ovens. It was a brutal, regulated, politically charged profession that could kill you in about a dozen different ways before breakfast. William stumbles through his workshop in near total darkness, feeling his way to the massive stone oven that dominates the back wall of his shop. This oven, built into the very structure of his building, cost him 3 years' earnings and represents both his livelihood and his potential destruction. Medieval ovens aren't the convenient gas or electric appliances we know today. They're essentially controlled forest fires contained within tons of stone and clay. Getting the temperature right requires the kind of intuitive understanding that comes from years of burns, failures, and ruined batches. The fuel alone presents a constant crisis. William needs enormous quantities of wood, not just any wood, but specific types that burn at the right temperature for the right amount of time. Oak burns too hot and too fast. Pine fills the bread with resin flavors that customers hate, and green wood produces so much smoke that it turns the loaves black and bitter. Good, seasoned hardwood costs more than many people earn in a month, and William is constantly calculating whether he can afford to heat his oven properly or whether he needs to risk underbaking his bread to save fuel costs. But the real nightmare of medieval baking isn't the physical challenges, it's the suffocating web of regulations, guild politics, and economic pressures that control every aspect of the profession. William belongs to the Bakers Guild, which sounds prestigious until you understand that guild membership is less like joining a professional organization and more like being trapped in an economic prison with very specific rules about how you're allowed to starve. The guild controls everything: who can bake, what they can bake, how much they can charge, where they can sell, and even what ingredients they're allowed to use. William is licensed specifically to bake white bread for the wealthy and brown bread for everyone else. He's forbidden from making pastries because that's the domain of the pastry guild, and he can't sell meat pies because that requires membership in both the Bakers Guild and the Butchers Guild, along with additional fees he could never afford. The penalty for baking outside your designated specialty isn't just a fine, it's expulsion from the guild, confiscation of your equipment, and effectively being banned from your profession for life. The guild also controls pricing through a system so complex and corrupt that it makes modern tax codes look straightforward. The price of bread is theoretically set by municipal authorities based on the current price of grain, but in practice is determined by backroom negotiations between guild leaders and city officials that always seem to favour everyone except the actual bakers. William is required to sell his bread at fixed prices regardless of his costs, meaning that when grain prices spike during famines or poor harvests, he's forced to choose between taking losses that could bankrupt him or reducing the size and quality of his loaves in ways that technically violate guild standards but might keep him solvent. Quality control in medieval baking is enforced through a system so arbitrary and punitive that it would make modern health inspectors look like benevolent advisors. Guild inspectors can enter William's shop at any time, test his products using standards that seem to change depending on their mood, and impose fines for infractions that range from legitimate safety concerns to completely subjective complaints about taste, texture, or appearance. These inspections aren't random, they're often triggered by complaints from competitors who want to eliminate rival bakers, or by city officials who need to raise revenue and see guild fines as easy money. The infamous assizes of bread and ale represent medieval regulation at its most brutal and absurd. These are laws that dictate not just the price of bread, but its exact weight, ingredients, and even the precise relationship between the size of a loaf and the current market price of wheat. William must constantly adjust his recipes and portion sizes based on grain prices that fluctuate daily, and getting the calculations wrong results in fines that can be devastating. Too light, and he's cheating customers. Too heavy, and he's selling below the legally mandated price point. The margin for error is essentially zero, and the penalties for mistakes are severe enough to destroy his business. But here's where it gets really insidious. The people enforcing these regulations are often corrupt, incompetent, or both. Guild officials frequently demand bribes to overlook minor infractions. City inspectors have been known to deliberately sabotage bakers they don't like, and the legal system that's supposed to protect guild members is routinely manipulated by wealthy competitors who can afford better lawyers. William has seen fellow bakers ruined, not because they were bad at their craft, but because they couldn't navigate the political complexities of their profession or didn't have the right connections with guild leadership. The physical demands of medieval baking would crush most modern workers within a week. William's day begins at 2 a.m. with lighting his massive oven, a process that requires hauling hundreds of pounds of wood, building and maintaining a fire hot enough to heat several tons of stone, and somehow calculating the exact moment when the oven reaches optimal baking temperature. There are no thermometers, no timers, no measuring devices of any kind. Everything depends on experience, intuition, and the kind of sensory awareness that takes decades to develop. Kneading dough for an entire town's bread consumption is a full-body workout that makes modern gym routines look gentle. Medieval bread dough is made from coarser flour, requires more intensive mixing, and must be worked entirely by hand. William spends hours each day kneading massive batches of dough that leave his arms, shoulders, and back screaming with pain. The repetitive motion causes chronic injuries that medieval medicine is powerless to treat, and most career bakers develop permanent damage to their joints and muscles that makes every movement painful. The heat from the ovens turns the bakery into a furnace that's barely tolerable in winter and absolutely hellish in summer. William works in temperatures that would be considered dangerous by modern occupational safety standards, constantly sweating, dehydrated, and at risk of heat exhaustion. The combination of physical exertion and extreme heat leads to a constant cycle of exhaustion that affects his judgment, increases the risk of accidents, and gradually breaks down his health over the years. Burns are an occupational hazard so common that William considers a day without minor injuries to be remarkably lucky. Medieval ovens don't have safety features, protective equipment, or even basic guards around the most dangerous areas. Bakers routinely suffer burns from handling hot bread, loading and unloading ovens, and working around open flames and heated surfaces. Serious burns are treated with remedies that range from useless to actively harmful. An infection from burn injuries kills or permanently disables a significant percentage of professional bakers. The ingredients William works with present their own unique challenges and dangers. Medieval flour isn't the refined, consistent product we know today. It's coarse, often contaminated with dirt, chaff, and occasionally poisonous seeds that get mixed in during harvesting and milling. Flour quality varies dramatically from batch to batch, requiring constant adjustments to recipes and techniques. Bad flour can ruin entire batches of bread, leading to financial losses that William can't afford and guild penalties he can't avoid. Water, the most basic ingredient in bread, is a constant source of problems in medieval cities. William depends on clean water for his dough, but medieval water supplies are routinely contaminated with sewage, animal waste, and industrial runoff from other trades. Using contaminated water can make his bread taste terrible, cause it to spoil quickly, or even make his customers sick, any of which can result in guild sanctions and loss of business. He's forced to pay premium prices for clean water, adding another layer of cost to his already tight profit margins. Yeast, essential for bread production, doesn't exist as a commercial product that William can simply purchase. Instead, he must maintain his own yeast cultures using techniques passed down through generations of bakers. These cultures are living organisms that require constant care, proper feeding, and ideal storage conditions that are almost impossible to maintain in a medieval workshop. A failed yeast culture means no bread, no income, and potentially the end of his business. William treats his yeast starter like a family pet, because in many ways his family's survival depends on keeping these microscopic organisms alive and healthy. The economic realities of medieval baking make modern small business challenges look trivial. William operates on profit margins so thin that a single bad week can push him toward bankruptcy. He must buy ingredients in advance, often borrowing money at usurious interest rates to purchase grain when prices are relatively low. But grain prices fluctuate wildly based on weather, political instability, trade disruptions, and dozens of other factors beyond his control. A poor harvest in a distant region can double his costs overnight, while guild regulations prevent him from raising his prices to compensate. Customer credit is both essential and dangerous in William's business. Many of his customers can't afford to pay cash for their daily bread, especially during the lean months before harvest, when food prices are highest and wages are lowest. William is forced to extend credit to maintain his customer base, But medieval debt collection is a brutal and often hopeless process. Customers who can't pay their bread debts might flee the town, die from disease, or simply disappear, leaving William to absorb the losses. Too much outstanding credit can destroy his cash flow, but refusing credit means losing customers to competitors who are willing to take the risk. The social position of bakers in medieval society is far more precarious than their essential role would suggest. While everyone needs bread, bakers are viewed with suspicion and often outright hostility by both customers and authorities. They're seen as profiteers who manipulate food prices during times of scarcity as potential sources of contamination and disease, and as members of a trade that's inherently prone to cheating and fraud. Anti-baker sentiment runs so deep in medieval culture that bakers are frequently scapegoated for economic problems, food shortages, and public health crises that have nothing to do with their actual practices. This social hostility translates into real danger for William and his family. During times of economic stress, angry mobs have been known to attack bakeries, destroy equipment, and even kill bakers who are blamed for high bread prices or poor quality. William must navigate not just the economic and regulatory challenges of his profession, but also the constant threat of violence from customers who see him as an enemy rather than someone providing an essential service. Competition between bakers is viciously cutthroat in ways that would make modern business rivalries look genteel, with guild regulations preventing price competition and limiting innovation. Bakers compete through sabotage, political manipulation, and character assassination. William has seen competitors spread rumors about contaminated flour, bribe guild inspectors to target rival bakeries, and even resort to physical violence to eliminate competition. The medieval marketplace isn't governed by modern concepts of fair competition. It's a barely regulated war, where survival often depends more on political connections and willingness to engage in underhanded tactics than on actual baking skill. The guild system that's supposed to protect bakers often functions more like an organized crime syndicate that extracts money from its members while providing minimal benefits in return. Guild dues are substantial and mandatory, but the services provided in exchange are often inadequate or non-existent. The guild claims to provide mutual support during hard times, but in practice, assistance goes primarily to bakers who have political influence or personal connections with guild leadership. William pays his dues faithfully, but knows that if he faces a real crisis, he'll be largely on his own. Seasonal variations create additional layers of complexity and stress in William's work. Winter baking requires more fuel to heat the oven and workshop, driving up costs just when customer incomes are typically lowest. Summer heat makes working conditions nearly unbearable and causes bread to spoil more quickly, reducing his profit margins and increasing waste. Spring flour, milled from grain that's been stored through the winter, often has quality problems that affect bread texture and flavor. Fall harvest time brings fluctuating grain prices and uncertainty about winter supplies that force William to make risky financial decisions about inventory and purchasing. The relationship between bakers and millers represents another source of constant tension and economic pressure. William depends on millers for his flour, but millers are notoriously untrustworthy business people who routinely adulterate their products, manipulate weights and measures, and charge inflated prices during times of scarcity. Medieval flour is often stretched with cheaper substitutes like ground peas, beans, or even sawdust that make bread taste terrible and potentially harm customers' health. William must constantly test and evaluate his flour supplies, but he has limited alternatives if his regular miller is cheating him or providing substandard products. Religious and cultural restrictions add yet another layer of complexity to William's profession. The Catholic Church mandates specific types of bread for religious ceremonies, and William must be prepared to produce these specialty products on short notice while meeting exact specifications for ingredients and preparation methods. Failure to meet church requirements can result in religious sanctions that are even more devastating than guild penalties. Additionally, Jewish and Muslim communities in many medieval cities have their own bread requirements that create niche markets, but also require specialized knowledge and separate production facilities to avoid cross-contamination. The legal system that governs William's profession is a nightmare of conflicting jurisdictions, arbitrary enforcement, and corruption that makes modern bureaucracy look efficient and fair. Guild courts handle some disputes, municipal authorities control others, and religious officials oversee matters related to church bread. Different courts often reach contradictory decisions about the same issues, and appeals processes are expensive, time-consuming, and heavily biased toward defendants who can afford better legal representation. William has learned that staying out of court is far more important than being right, which means accepting losses and abuses that would be actionable under modern legal systems. Health and safety conditions in medieval bakeries would horrify modern inspectors and probably violate numerous international labour standards. William works with dangerous equipment, toxic fumes from poorly ventilated ovens, and contaminated ingredients that pose constant health risks. Flour dust fills the air he breathes, causing respiratory problems that medieval medicine can't treat effectively. Chemical preservatives don't exist, so spoiled ingredients are a constant concern that can lead to food poisoning outbreaks affecting entire neighborhoods. When customers get sick from contaminated bread, the baker is held responsible, regardless of whether the contamination occurred during production, storage, or sale. The apprenticeship system that's supposed to train new bakers often functions more like legalized child labor that exploits young workers while providing minimal education. William is expected to take on apprentices who work long hours for minimal compensation while theoretically learning the trade. In practice, apprentices spend most of their time on menial tasks that have little educational value, but save William the cost of hiring adult workers. The apprentices' families pay significant fees for this education, and the young people often emerge from their apprenticeships with limited skills and few prospects for advancement. Family life for a medieval baker is shaped entirely by the demands of the profession in ways that make modern work-life balance discussions seem quaint. William's wife and children are all involved in the business by necessity, but guild regulations and social customs limit their official roles and compensation. His wife handles customer service and financial records, but isn't allowed to join the guild or own the business in her own name. His children work in the bakery from early ages, but face limited opportunities for advancement within a system that prioritizes male guild members over family members, regardless of their actual skills or contributions. The constant financial pressure and physical demands of medieval baking take a severe toll on William's mental and physical health. Chronic stress from unpredictable income, regulatory harassment, and competitive pressures creates anxiety and depression that medieval society doesn't recognize as legitimate medical conditions. The physical demands of the work cause premature aging, chronic pain, and disabilities that force many bakers into early retirement or career changes they can't afford. William watches older bakers struggle with injuries and health problems that make continued work impossible, but have no alternatives for supporting themselves or their families. Disease outbreaks represent catastrophic risks for medieval bakers that go far beyond modern business interruption concerns. When plague, cholera, or other epidemic diseases strike a community, Bakers face impossible choices between continuing to work and risking infection, or closing their businesses and facing financial ruin. Customers become suspicious of all food vendors during disease outbreaks, and bakers are often blamed for spreading illness even when they're not responsible. The economic disruption from major epidemics can destroy years of careful financial planning and force established bakers into poverty overnight. Technology limitations make medieval baking far more labor-intensive and less predictable than modern food production. William has no mechanical mixers, no precise measuring devices, no reliable timers, and no quality control equipment beyond his own senses and experience. Every batch of bread requires individual attention and adjustment based on countless variables that change from day to day. There's no mass production, no standardization, and no efficiency improvements that might reduce costs or increase profits. Innovation is actively discouraged by guild regulations that mandate traditional methods and punish experimentation. The irony of William's profession is that despite providing one of society's most essential services, he operates within a system designed to prevent him from succeeding too dramatically. Guild regulations, municipal controls, and social prejudices all work together to keep bakers profitable enough to continue working, but not successful enough to accumulate significant wealth or social power. It's a carefully maintained balance that ensures bread production continues while preventing bakers from using their essential role to demand better treatment or fair compensation. Weather dependency makes medieval baking far more unpredictable than modern food production. Rain affects oven heating, humidity changes dough behavior, and extreme temperatures make working conditions dangerous or impossible. William must constantly adjust his techniques and schedules based on weather conditions that he can't predict or control. Bad weather can ruin entire batches of bread, delay production schedules, and create supply shortages that lead to customer complaints and guild sanctions. The waste disposal challenges of medieval baking create ongoing health and regulatory problems that William must navigate carefully. Failed bread, spoiled ingredients, and production byproducts must be disposed of in ways that don't violate municipal sanitation laws or create health hazards for his neighbours. Medieval waste management is primitive and often ineffective, and improper disposal can lead to fines, health problems, and conflicts with other residents. William spends considerable time and effort managing waste streams that modern bakers handle through established municipal services. Storage and inventory management in William's bakery require constant vigilance and sophisticated techniques that medieval technology can barely support. Grain and flour must be protected from moisture, pests, theft, and contamination without the benefit of modern storage containers, climate control, or security systems. William loses significant quantities of ingredients to spoilage, theft, and pest damage, but these losses come directly from his already thin profit margins. Insurance doesn't exist, so every loss represents a permanent reduction in his family's economic security. By the time William reaches middle age, the cumulative effects of his profession have transformed him from a young man with dreams of prosperity into a physically broken, financially stressed survivor who continues working primarily because he has no other options. His hands are scarred from countless burns, his back is permanently damaged from years of heavy lifting, and his lungs are compromised from breathing flour dust and oven fumes. He's survived guild politics, economic crises, disease outbreaks, and countless regulatory challenges, but survival isn't the same as success. Modern bakers who complain about health department inspections, competition from grocery stores, or the challenges of running a small business have no comprehension of how fortunate they are to work within systems that recognize their basic rights, provide legal protections, and offer opportunities for genuine success. Even the most regulated modern bakery operates with freedoms that William could never imagine. The ability to set prices based on costs, to innovate and experiment with new products, to compete fairly without fear of sabotage or violence, and to build wealth through honest work. The medieval baker's experience reveals how professional regulation can become professional oppression when it's designed to serve political and economic interests rather than public welfare or professional development. Modern professional licensing and regulation, for all their flaws, still aim to protect both practitioners and consumers while maintaining fair competition and opportunities for advancement. Medieval guild systems aimed primarily to maintain existing power structures and prevent economic or social mobility that might threaten established hierarchies. William's story illustrates how economic systems can trap people in cycles of poverty and stress, even when they're working in essential professions that should provide security and prosperity. His skills are valuable, his work is necessary, and his dedication is absolute, but the system within which he operates ensures that these advantages never translate into genuine economic security or social advancement. He remains perpetually vulnerable to forces beyond his control, working harder and harder for rewards that seem to diminish with each passing year. Perhaps most tragically, William's profession, which should be a source of pride and community connection, has become a source of stress, conflict, and social isolation. Instead of being respected as someone who provides essential services, he's viewed with suspicion and hostility. Instead of finding camaraderie with fellow bakers, he faces cutthroat competition and political manipulation. Instead of building wealth and security for his family, he struggles daily with financial pressures that threaten their survival. The next time you grab a loaf of bread from the grocery store, or complain about the price of artisanal baked goods, or take for granted the consistent quality and safety of modern bread, remember William the baker and his medieval colleagues. Remember that your ability to buy good bread at reasonable prices from businesses that compete fairly and operate under transparent regulations represents a kind of economic and social progress that would have seemed miraculous to someone trapped in the brutal realities of medieval commercial life. The year is 1847, and Margaret Sullivan has just given birth to her fifth child in the upstairs bedroom of her Boston boarding house. The baby, Mai, arrived after 14 hours of labour, with only her neighbour Mrs. O'Brien and the local midwife in attendance. Her husband Patrick won't even know he has a son until he returns from his 12-hour shift at the textile mill. And the elaborate process of announcing this birth to the wider world is about to begin. But here's what nobody tells you about 19th this century birth announcements. They weren't just about sharing happy news. They were complex social rituals that determined your family's place in the community, your child's future prospects, and sometimes even whether your baby would be acknowledged as legitimate by the people who mattered most. In our age of instant social media updates and hospital birth announcements, it's almost impossible to imagine how difficult, expensive, and politically charged the simple act of telling people about a new baby could be. Margaret's announcement process will take weeks to complete, cost money her family can barely afford, and require navigating social hierarchies so rigid that a single mistake could affect her child's entire future. The Victorian era didn't just complicate birth announcements, it turned them into elaborate performances of social status, religious devotion, and family respectability that could make or break a family's reputation. The first challenge Margaret faces is immediate and practical: how to get word to Patrick at the mill without causing a scene that might cost him his job. Factory workers aren't allowed personal visitors during shifts, and leaving work for any reason other than serious injury or death often results in termination. Margaret can't simply send a messenger to tell Patrick he's become a father again. She needs to find someone who can discreetly get word to him without alerting the floor supervisors who see any personal distraction as grounds for firing. Mrs. O'Brien, the neighbour who assisted with the birth, volunteers to send her teenage son Timothy to the mill with a coded message. Timothy will approach Patrick during the brief lunch break and tell him that the package he ordered has arrived safely. A pre-arranged phrase that means the baby has been born alive. This system of coded communications isn't paranoia, it's economic survival in an era when factory workers have no job security and employers routinely fire people for reasons that would be illegal today. But getting word to the father is just the beginning of Margaret's announcement challenges. In 19th century society, the legitimacy and social acceptance of a birth depends heavily on how it's announced and to whom. The order in which people are notified, the method of notification used, and even the specific wording of announcements all carry social meanings that can enhance or damage a family's reputation. Margaret must carefully orchestrate a complex sequence of notifications that acknowledges social hierarchies while protecting her family's interests. The first formal announcement goes to the parish priest, Father McManus, who must be notified within 24 hours if the family wants to schedule a baptism within the socially acceptable time frame. In Irish Catholic communities, like Margaret's, delayed baptism is seen as evidence of either poverty, illegitimacy, or lack of religious commitment, any of which can result in social ostracism that affects the entire family's prospects. Father McManus will also be responsible for recording the birth in the church register, which serves as the primary official record since government birth certificates don't exist in most areas. The church notification process reveals the complex relationship between religious and social authority in 19th century communities. Father McManus doesn't simply record births, he investigates them. He'll want to confirm that Margaret and Patrick are legitimately married, that the timing of the birth is consistent with moral behaviour, and that the family is in good standing with the church. Families who haven't been regular in their church attendance, who are behind on their tithe payments, or who have other marks against their reputation, may find their birth announcements met with scepticism or even refusal to perform baptismal services. Margaret's next challenge is notifying Patrick's employer not to request time off for the birth, which would be considered presumptuous, but to ensure that any future requests for advancement or better treatment take into account his growing family responsibilities. This notification must be handled delicately, because while having children proves a man's respectability and stability, it also marks him as someone with expensive obligations who might be desperate enough to accept lower wages. Margaret drafts a carefully worded letter expressing gratitude for Patrick's employment and mentioning the family's continued commitment to stable, long-term residence in the community. The social announcement process begins with the women's networks that form the backbone of 19th century community communication. Margaret's first visitors are other mothers from the neighbourhood who arrive ostensibly to help with household duties, but actually to evaluate the new baby and gather information for the community gossip networks that determine social standing. These women will examine the baby's health, assess the family's living conditions, and make judgments about Margaret's competence as a mother that will influence how the family is treated by neighbours, shopkeepers, and potential employers. The visiting ritual follows strict protocols that Margaret ignores at her peril. Visitors must be offered tea and whatever modest refreshments the family can afford, even though money is desperately tight and Margaret is barely recovered from childbirth. The condition of the baby's clothing, the cleanliness of the house, and Margaret's ability to maintain conversation while managing her other children all become subjects for community evaluation. Women who fail to meet the neighborhood's standards for postpartum entertaining may find themselves excluded from the mutual support networks that are essential for survival in working-class communities. Letter writing becomes Margaret's primary tool for reaching family members and friends who live beyond walking distance. But 19th century postal service is expensive, unreliable, and subject to delays that can make time-sensitive communications nearly impossible. A letter announcing the birth costs more than Patrick earns in half a day, and there's no guarantee it will reach its destination within weeks or even months. Margaret must decide which relatives deserve the expense of postal notification and which will have to wait for less costly methods of communication. The content and style of birth announcement letters follow elaborate conventions that reveal as much about the family's social aspirations as about the actual birth. Margaret's letters must strike a delicate balance between expressing appropriate joy and maintaining suitable humility. Too much celebration suggests vanity and lack of proper Christian submission to God's will. Too little enthusiasm implies the baby isn't wanted or the family is experiencing problems. The letters must also include coded information about the family's financial status, health and social connections that will be carefully analysed by recipients looking for opportunities to help or reasons to maintain distance. For families with social pretensions, birth announcements become elaborate productions involving custom stationery, formal calligraphy, and expensive postal services that can cost more than a week's wages. Margaret's working-class family can't afford such luxuries, but they still feel pressure to present their announcement in ways that suggest respectability and stability. She spends hours crafting announcements on the best paper she can afford, practicing her penmanship to ensure the letters reflect well on the family's education and social consciousness. The timing of announcements carries its own complex social meanings. Immediate announcements suggest either improper eagerness to share news or anxiety about the baby's survival prospects. Delayed announcements imply either lack of preparation or problems with the birth that the family doesn't want to discuss. Margaret must wait exactly the right amount of time, typically 3 to 5 days after birth, before beginning her formal announcements. And even then, the order in which people are notified sends messages about their relative importance to the family. Newspaper birth announcements represent the pinnacle of public notification, but they're expensive luxuries that most working families can't afford. The cost of placing a birth announcement in the Boston newspapers exceeds Patrick's weekly wages, making it an impossible expense for a family that's already struggling to pay rent and buy food. Families who do manage newspaper announcements gain significant social prestige, but they also open themselves to scrutiny and potential criticism from community members who think they're putting on airs above their station. The class dynamics of birth announcements reveal the rigid social hierarchies that dominate 19th century society. Wealthy families announce births through multiple channels, newspaper notices, printed cards, formal receptions, and elaborate christening ceremonies that demonstrate their social connections and financial resources. Middle-class families modify these traditions to fit their budgets, using less expensive versions of the same announcement methods. Working-class families, like Margaret's, must find ways to participate in announcement rituals without spending money they don't have or appearing to claim social status they haven't earned. Religious considerations add another layer of complexity to birth announcements. Different denominations have varying requirements for notification, baptism timing, and record keeping that families must navigate carefully. Catholic families like Margaret's must announce births to church authorities quickly to ensure proper baptismal scheduling, but they also need to consider how their announcements will be received by Protestant neighbours and employers who may harbour anti-Catholic prejudices. Religious minorities face even greater challenges. needing to balance community obligations with the potential for discrimination based on their faith. Immigration status creates additional complications for birth announcements that native-born families don't face. Irish immigrants like Margaret and Patrick must be careful that their birth announcements don't draw unwanted attention from authorities or community members who view immigrants with suspicion. They need to demonstrate their commitment to American values and social norms while maintaining connections to their ethnic community. A balancing act that requires careful consideration of how announcements are worded and to whom they're directed. The gender of the baby significantly affects how births are announced and received. Sons are generally announced with more enthusiasm and ceremony because they're seen as economic assets who will eventually support their parents and carry on the family name. Daughters are announced more quietly because they represent future expenses for dowries and wedding costs, while providing less long-term economic benefit. Margaret's announcement of a son will be received more favourably than if she had given birth to another daughter, a harsh reality that reflects the economic calculations that dominate family planning in an era without social safety nets. Birth order also influences announcement practices in ways that seem cruel by modern standards. First sons receive elaborate announcements because they represent the continuation of the family line and the primary source of future economic security. Later children, especially daughters, often receive much more modest announcements as families become more focused on practical concerns and less excited about additional mouths to feed. Margaret's fifth child will be announced with far less fanfare than her first, not because he's less loved, but because the family's resources and community attention are limited. The economic implications of birth announcements extend far beyond their immediate costs. How a birth is announced affects the family's credit standing with local merchants, their relationships with potential employers, and their access to community resources during future crises. Families who announce births in ways that suggest financial stability may find it easier to obtain credit, secure better housing, or gain access to employment opportunities. Those whose announcements suggest poverty or social problems may face discrimination that affects their prospects for years to come. Record-keeping challenges make birth announcements serve functions that go far beyond social communication. In an era before standardized birth certificates, the announcements themselves often provide the only documentary evidence that a child was born to specific parents at a particular time. These announcements may later be needed to prove citizenship, establish inheritance rights, or qualify for various benefits and opportunities. Margaret must ensure that her announcements are preserved and that enough people receive them to establish a clear record of her son's birth and parentage. The medical aspects of birth announcements reflect the harsh realities of 19th century infant mortality. Many families delay announcements until they're confident the baby will survive the dangerous first weeks of life. But this delay can create social problems if community members interpret it as evidence of illegitimacy or family dysfunction. Margaret must balance the practical wisdom of waiting to see if her son survives against the social necessity of timely announcements that establish his place in the community. Literacy requirements create barriers for birth announcements that affect families across all social classes. While basic literacy is becoming more common by the 1840s, many people still can't read or write well enough to compose proper announcement letters. Families who lack adequate writing skills must either rely on literate neighbours for help, creating obligations and potential for embarrassment, or settle for verbal announcements that carry less social weight. Margaret's ability to write her own announcements gives her family a significant advantage over neighbours who must depend on others for this essential communication. The physical challenges of creating and distributing birth announcements in the 19th century would exhaust modern parents who are used to digital communication. Margaret must handwrite multiple copies of each announcement, arrange for delivery through unreliable postal services or personal messengers, and coordinate the timing of notifications across multiple channels. The process requires weeks of work during a period when she's recovering from childbirth and caring for a newborn while managing her other children and household responsibilities. Cultural expectations about maternal behavior during the announcement period add another layer of stress to an already complicated process. Margaret is expected to maintain proper feminine modesty about the birth, while also ensuring that adequate announcements are made to protect her child's social standing. She must appear appropriately grateful for her blessing, while avoiding any suggestion that she's proud or boastful about her family's growth. The balance between necessary communication and proper humility requires careful consideration of every word and gesture. Community surveillance of birth announcements means that Margaret's every decision will be analysed and judged by neighbours, relatives, and community leaders looking for evidence of the family's character and prospects. Announcements that are too elaborate suggest vanity and financial irresponsibility. Those that are too modest imply poverty or lack of proper family feeling. The community expects announcements that demonstrate exactly the right balance of joy, humility, gratitude, and social awareness. Nearly impossible standard that leaves families vulnerable to criticism regardless of their choices. The long-term consequences of birth announcement decisions extend far beyond the immediate period following birth. How Margaret announces her son's arrival will influence how he's treated by teachers, potential employers, marriage prospects, and community leaders throughout his life. A well-executed announcement process can open doors and create opportunities. A poorly handled one can create barriers that affect multiple generations. The pressure to get everything right is enormous, especially for families who lack the social connections and financial resources to recover from mistakes. International communication adds even greater complexity for immigrant families who want to notify relatives in their countries of origin. Letters to Ireland can take months to arrive and cost far more than domestic postage, making international birth announcements a luxury that most working families simply cannot afford. Margaret would love to tell her parents about their new grandson, but the cost of international postage represents more money than the family spends on food in a month. Her parents may not learn about the birth until much later, if at all. The seasonal timing of births affects announcement practices in ways that modern families rarely consider. Winter births, like Margaret's, presents special challenges because travel is difficult, postal service is unreliable, and social visiting is limited by weather conditions. Summer births allow for more elaborate announcement activities, but occur during periods when many community members are travelling or working longer hours. The timing of birth affects not just the immediate announcement process, but also the scheduling of baptisms, christening parties, and other social events that follow. Professional obligations complicate birth announcements for families whose livelihoods depend on maintaining specific social relationships. Patrick's position at the mill requires that his family maintain good relationships with supervisors, foremen, and other workers who could affect his job security. Margaret's announcements must acknowledge these professional relationships without appearing to presume upon them or create obligations that the family cannot fulfill. The balance between proper respect and appropriate distance requires careful attention to social nuances that can determine the family's economic future. The documentation requirements for birth announcements reveal the complex bureaucratic challenges of 19th century life. Margaret must ensure that her son's birth is properly recorded in church registers, family Bibles, and whatever government records exist in her locality. Each recording system has its own requirements and procedures, and failures to complete proper documentation can create legal and social problems that persist for decades. The administrative burden of properly documenting a birth requires knowledge, time, and resources that many families struggle to provide. Photographic birth announcements are beginning to appear among wealthy families by the 1840s, but they remain expensive novelties that are completely beyond the reach of working-class families like Margaret's. The cost of having a professional photograph taken exceeds most families' annual income, and the technical requirements for infant photography make it an uncertain and potentially dangerous process. Families who can afford photographic announcements gain enormous social prestige, but they also set standards that create pressure and resentment among those who cannot compete with such displays of wealth. The intersection of birth announcements with ethnic and regional prejudices creates additional challenges for immigrant families trying to establish themselves in American communities. Margaret's Irish heritage means that her announcements must overcome anti-Irish sentiment while demonstrating her family's commitment to American values and social norms. The wording of announcements, the choice of notification methods, and even the timing of various communications all carry ethnic implications that can affect how the family is received by their predominantly Protestant neighbours. Legal implications of birth announcements extend far beyond their social functions, especially for families whose children may later need to prove their citizenship or inheritance rights. The announcements themselves may serve as legal documents in disputes over parentage, property rights, or eligibility for various benefits. Margaret must ensure that her announcements are worded carefully and preserved properly to protect her son's future legal interests, even though she may not fully understand all the potential implications of her choices. The emotional toll of managing complex birth announcement requirements during a period of physical recovery and family adjustment cannot be underestimated. Margaret is dealing with postpartum health issues, the demands of a newborn, the needs of her other children, and the ongoing challenges of poverty, while simultaneously orchestrating a complicated social communication process that could affect her family's future for generations. The stress of getting everything right while managing so many competing demands would challenge even the most capable modern parent with access to contemporary communication technology and support systems. By the time Margaret completes her birth announcement process, several weeks after her son's birth, she has navigated a complex web of social expectations, religious requirements, economic constraints, and cultural pressures that would overwhelm most modern parents. Her success in properly announcing the birth establishes her son's place in the community and opens whatever opportunities might be available to a working-class Irish-American boy in mid-19th century Boston. Her failure to meet community standards could have created barriers and prejudices that would have affected his prospects throughout his life. The elaborate birth announcement rituals of the 19th century reveal how much we take for granted about our modern ability to share news quickly, cheaply, and without extensive social consequences. Margaret's experience shows how something as simple as telling people about a new baby could become a complex political and economic challenge that required careful planning, significant resources, and sophisticated understanding of social dynamics. Modern parents who announce births through social media, hospital notifications, or simple phone calls are participating in communication processes that would have seemed miraculous to 19th century families struggling with the enormous challenges of properly introducing their children to the world. The year is 1782, and Marie-Claire Dubois is standing ankle-deep in steaming water at 4 o'clock in the morning, scrubbing a silk camise that belongs to Marie Antoinette herself. Her hands are already raw from the caustic lye soap. Her back aches from bending over the massive washing tubs, and she knows that one small stain missed, one tiny tear caused by overzealous scrubbing, could result in her immediate dismissal from Versailles or worse. But here's what nobody tells you about working in the royal laundry. It wasn't just about getting clothes clean, it was about navigating the most dangerous political environment in Europe, where knowing too much about the wrong underwear could get you executed, and where the difference between revolution and royalty was often determined by who controlled the dirty linen. Marie Claire occupies one of the most paradoxical positions in the French royal court, simultaneously invisible and indispensable, trusted with the most intimate secrets of the royal family, yet considered so insignificant that she's barely acknowledged as human. She knows which ladies in waiting are having affairs based on the stains on their undergarments, which courtiers are suffering from venereal diseases based on the medicinal residues on their clothing, and which nobles are so deeply in debt that they're wearing the same camise for weeks because they can't afford replacements. This knowledge makes her simultaneously powerful and vulnerable in ways that would be impossible in any other social system. The Versailles Laundry Complex is a vast underground operation that most visitors to the palace never see or even imagine. Located in the basement levels beneath the main palace, it consists of dozens of rooms filled with enormous copper vats, intricate networks of pipes carrying water at different temperatures, and storage areas that house thousands of pieces of royal clothing awaiting cleaning, repair, or seasonal rotation. The scale of the operation is staggering. Marie Claire is one of nearly 200 laundry workers responsible for maintaining the clothing of a royal court that includes thousands of people, each of whom changes clothes multiple times per day and considers wearing the same outfit twice to be a social catastrophe. The hierarchy within the royal laundry is as rigid and complex as any other aspect of court life. At the top are the head laundresses, middle-aged women who have spent decades learning the specific requirements for cleaning different types of royal garments and who wield almost absolute power over the workers beneath them. Below them are the specialist washers who handle only the most delicate items, silk stockings, lace accessories, and the Queen's personal undergarments that require techniques so specialized that they're passed down like state secrets. Marie Claire occupies a middle position as a general laundress responsible for the everyday clothing of minor courtiers and servants, but she aspires to advance to the prestigious position of handling royal undergarments, a job that comes with better pay and the kind of access to royal secrets that can be converted into economic opportunities. The working conditions in the royal laundry would violate every modern labour law and probably several international human rights conventions. Marie Claire works 14-hour days in rooms that are perpetually filled with steam, caustic fumes from soap and bleaching agents, and temperatures that range from freezing in the winter to unbearably hot in the summer. The floors are constantly wet and slippery, creating endless opportunities for injuries that receive no medical attention beyond basic first aid. The air is so thick with moisture and chemical vapors that many workers develop chronic respiratory problems, and the combination of heat, humidity, and toxic substances creates working conditions that would be considered dangerous even by 18th century standards. The soap used in the royal laundry is made from lye so caustic that it can burn through skin, and Marie Claire's hands are permanently damaged from years of exposure to chemicals that modern safety regulations would never permit workers to handle without protective equipment. The lye is made from wood ash and animal fat, creating a product that's effective at removing stains but devastating to human tissue. Workers regularly suffer chemical burns that leave permanent scarring, and many develop skin conditions that make any contact with soap or water excruciatingly painful. The royal administrators know about these health problems, but consider them acceptable casualties in the pursuit of perfectly clean royal garments. Water management in the Versailles laundry represents one of the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering projects of the 18th century. but it also creates constant operational challenges that make Marie Claire's work unpredictable and dangerous. The palace's water system depends on pumps and reservoirs that frequently break down, leaving the laundry without adequate supplies for washing or rinsing. When the water pressure drops, workers must carry water manually from outdoor sources, adding hours of back-breaking labor to their already overwhelming schedules. The water itself is often contaminated with sewage, animal waste, and industrial runoff that makes it unsuitable for cleaning delicate fabrics, forcing workers to find alternative sources that may be even more problematic. The temperature control systems in the laundry are primitive and unpredictable, creating constant challenges for workers who must adapt their techniques based on whatever water temperature happens to be available. Hot water is produced by wood-fired boilers that consume enormous quantities of fuel and require constant attention to maintain proper temperatures. When the boilers malfunction, which happens frequently, workers must either use cold water that won't remove stains effectively, or find ways to heat water manually, using methods that are time-consuming and dangerous. Marie Claire has been burned repeatedly by steam from overheated boilers and scalded by water that was much hotter than she expected. The drying process reveals another layer of complexity in royal laundry operations that goes far beyond simply hanging clothes on lines. Different types of fabric require specific drying conditions that must be carefully controlled to prevent shrinkage, color fading, or texture damage. Silk must be dried away from direct sunlight. Linen requires specific humidity levels, and wool needs to be shaped carefully while damp to maintain proper fit. The palace has elaborate drying rooms with controlled ventilation and temperature, but access to these facilities is strictly regulated based on the importance of the garments being processed. Marie Claire often finds herself trying to dry ordinary clothing using inadequate facilities, while the premium drying rooms are reserved for items that may be worn once and then never used again. The stain removal techniques used in the royal laundry represent centuries of accumulated knowledge about cleaning different types of substances from various fabrics. But they also involve processes that are dangerous, time-consuming, and often ineffective. Blood stains require soaking in cold water, followed by treatment with salt and lemon juice. Wine stains need immediate attention, with white wine followed by salt and careful blotting. Grease stains must be treated with chalk or ground bones to absorb the oil before washing. Each type of stain requires different chemicals and techniques, and the wrong treatment can permanently damage expensive fabric or set stains that become impossible to remove. Ink stains present particular challenges because 18th century ink is made from iron gall that actually chemically bonds with fabric fibers, making removal almost impossible without damaging the underlying material. Marie Claire has developed specialized techniques using milk, lemon juice, and salt that sometimes work but often result in permanent discoloration that she must hide through creative arrangement of garments or strategic placement of accessories. The pressure to remove ink stains is enormous because they're usually the result of accidents during letter writing or document signing, activities that are central to court life and can't be avoided. The political implications of laundry work at Versailles create constant dangers that Marie Claire must navigate with extreme care. The clothing she handles contains evidence of affairs, financial problems, health issues, and political conspiracies that could destroy careers or trigger international incidents if the information becomes public. A chemise with blood stains might indicate a miscarriage that the wearer wants to keep secret. Unusual stains on a courtier's breeches might suggest activities that violate moral or legal codes. Medicinal residues on undergarments could reveal health problems that affect succession planning or marriage negotiations. Marie Claire has learned to develop selective blindness about the information her work reveals, but she also understands that this knowledge represents potential wealth if she can find ways to monetize it without getting caught. The challenge is that selling secrets is a capital offense that could result in execution, while failing to profit from valuable information means remaining poor in an environment where poverty is itself dangerous. She must constantly balance the temptation to use what she knows against the very real risk that doing so could cost her life. The security measures surrounding royal laundry operations reflect the court's awareness that clothing can reveal state secrets and personal information that must be protected from foreign spies and domestic enemies. Access to different areas of the laundry is strictly controlled based on workers' seniority and trustworthiness, with the most sensitive areas reserved for employees who have been investigated by royal security forces. Marie Claire has been questioned repeatedly about her family background, political loyalties, and personal relationships to ensure that she doesn't pose a security risk to the royal family. The inventory control systems for royal clothing represent logistical challenges that would overwhelm modern supply chain managers, even with digital technology. The royal family owns thousands of garments that must be tracked, maintained, and rotated according to complex schedules based on seasonal requirements, court events, and fashion trends. Each piece must be catalogued, inspected for damage, cleaned according to specific protocols, and stored in precise locations that allow for quick retrieval when needed. Marie Claire spends hours each week updating handwritten records that track the location and condition of garments that may be worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. Theft prevention in the royal laundry creates an atmosphere of suspicion and surveillance that makes every worker a potential suspect and every interaction a possible source of trouble. Royal garments are so valuable that even small accessories like buttons, ribbons, or lace trim represent significant wealth that desperate workers might be tempted to steal. The laundry employs guards and supervisors whose primary job is to prevent theft, and workers are subject to random searches that can be humiliating and invasive. Marie Claire has seen colleagues dismissed and imprisoned for theft accusations that may have been false, creating an environment where everyone is afraid of everyone else. The seasonal rhythms of court life create dramatic variations in laundry workload that require workers to adapt to completely different schedules and priorities throughout the year. Winter court sessions generate enormous quantities of heavy clothing that requires specialized cleaning and storage techniques. Summer brings lighter fabrics, but more frequent changes due to heat and increased social activities. The hunting season creates massive quantities of clothing contaminated with mud, blood, and animal scents that require intensive cleaning processes. Holiday periods generate special ceremonial garments that must be cleaned and prepared according to protocols that are used only once or twice per year. The relationship between laundry workers and the court's fashion industry reveals how clothing maintenance supports an economic system that employs thousands of people in roles ranging from fabric production to accessory design. Marie Claire works closely with seamstresses, tailors, and fashion designers who modify and repair garments that have been damaged during cleaning or need updating to reflect current styles. This collaboration requires understanding not just cleaning techniques, but also fashion trends, construction methods, and the social significance of different clothing choices. Marie Claire's expertise in fabric care makes her valuable to courtiers who need advice about maintaining their wardrobes, but these consultations create additional political dangers that she must navigate carefully. Providing good advice can lead to tips and special favors that supplement her meager wages, but giving bad advice or being associated with fashion disasters can damage her reputation and limit her future opportunities. She must balance her desire to help clients with her need to protect herself from blame when things go wrong. The international dimensions of royal clothing care reflect France's position as the centre of European fashion and the political importance of maintaining appearances during a period of increasing social unrest. Garments worn by the royal family are scrutinised by foreign diplomats, fashion observers, and political commentators who analyse everything from fabric choices to styling decisions for evidence of France's economic health and political stability. Marie Claire's work contributes to projections of French power and cultural influence that have implications far beyond simple clothing maintenance. The economic impact of the royal laundry extends throughout the French economy in ways that most workers don't fully understand. The soap, bleaching agents, and other chemicals used in royal laundry represent significant portions of national chemical production. The fuel required to heat water and dry clothes consumes forest resources that could be used for other purposes. The specialized equipment and facilities required for royal laundry operations employ craftsmen, engineers, and construction workers whose livelihoods depend on maintaining royal standards for clothing care. Training new laundry workers requires years of apprenticeship that combines technical skills with political awareness and social understanding that can't be learned from books or formal instruction. Marie Claire spent 3 years as an apprentice learning not just how to clean different types of fabric, but also how to recognize the social significance of various garments, how to handle politically sensitive information, and how to navigate the complex hierarchies that govern life at Versailles. The training process is expensive and time-consuming, making skilled laundry workers valuable employees who have invested heavily in their specialized knowledge. The health consequences of long-term laundry work are severe and irreversible, affecting every aspect of workers' lives, both during and after their careers. Marie Claire's hands are permanently damaged from chemical exposure. Her back is twisted from years of bending over washing tubs, and her lungs are compromised from breathing steam and chemical fumes. Many retired laundry workers suffer from chronic pain, respiratory problems, and skin conditions that make normal activities difficult or impossible. The royal administration provides no medical care or pension benefits for workers whose health has been destroyed by their service to the crown. The social isolation of laundry workers reflects their ambiguous position in court society. They're too knowledgeable to be trusted with normal social relationships, but too low-ranking to be accepted by higher-status courtiers. Marie Claire's work gives her intimate knowledge of court life, but no real participation in it. She knows the personal secrets of people she can never speak to as equals, and she understands political situations that she can never discuss openly. This isolation creates psychological stress that compounds the physical demands of her work. Religious obligations create additional complexities for laundry workers who must balance their service to worldly authority with their spiritual responsibilities. The Catholic Church teaches that serving temporal rulers can conflict with serving God, especially when that service involves maintaining the luxurious lifestyle that many clergy consider sinful. Marie Claire must participate in religious services that condemn the very extravagance that her work supports, creating cognitive dissonance that affects her spiritual life and personal identity. The technological innovations being developed for royal laundry operations represent some of the most advanced engineering projects of the 18th century, but they also create new dangers and complications that workers must learn to navigate. New types of soap and bleaching agents offer improved cleaning results, but may cause unexpected health problems. Mechanical devices for moving heavy wet clothing reduce some physical demands, but introduce new safety hazards. Improved water heating systems provide better temperature control, but require maintenance skills that workers must acquire through trial and error. The food and housing provided to laundry workers reflects their essential but subordinate role in court life. Marie Claire receives basic meals that are adequate but unappetizing, consisting mainly of bread, soup, and occasional meat that's often of questionable quality. Her housing consists of a small room shared with 3 other workers in a building, located far from the main palace, with minimal furnishing and no privacy. The accommodations are designed to meet basic survival needs, while ensuring that workers remain focused on their duties rather than personal comfort. Family relationships become complicated for laundry workers, whose demanding schedules and specialized knowledge create barriers to normal social connections. Marie Claire rarely sees her family members who live outside Versailles, and when she does, she must be careful not to reveal information about court life that could be dangerous if it becomes public. Her knowledge of royal secrets makes her valuable, but also isolated, as she can never fully trust others with information that could get them all in trouble. Career advancement opportunities in the royal laundry are limited and heavily dependent on political connections, rather than technical skill or work quality. Workers who demonstrate exceptional ability at cleaning and maintaining royal garments may never advance if they lack the right sponsors or make enemies among supervisors. Conversely, workers with adequate skills but good political connections may advance quickly to positions of authority and higher pay. Marie Claire must constantly balance her desire to excel at her work with her need to maintain favorable relationships with people who control her career prospects. The record-keeping requirements for royal laundry operations create administrative burdens that affect every aspect of daily work. Marie Claire must document every garment she handles, noting its condition before and after cleaning, any special treatments used, and any problems encountered during the process. These records are reviewed by supervisors and auditors who look for evidence of theft, incompetence, or security breaches. The paperwork requirements consume hours each week that could be spent on actual laundry work, but failing to maintain proper records can result in dismissal or criminal prosecution. International tensions affect laundry operations in ways that workers rarely understand until they create serious problems. During periods of diplomatic conflict, clothing worn by foreign dignitaries requires special handling to avoid creating incidents that could escalate political tensions. Garments that have been contaminated with substances that might be interpreted as intentional poisoning or sabotage must be handled with extreme care and documented thoroughly to prevent international accusations. Marie Claire has learned to be especially careful when handling clothing belonging to foreign visitors, as mistakes in this area can have consequences far beyond simple employment problems. The psychological pressure of maintaining royal clothing standards while working under constant surveillance creates stress levels that affect workers' mental health and personal relationships. Marie Claire knows that every mistake is recorded and evaluated, that her techniques are constantly being observed and judged, and that her continued employment depends on maintaining performance standards that allow no room for human error. The constant pressure to be perfect while working with unpredictable materials and equipment creates anxiety that affects every aspect of her life. By 1782, the political situation in France is becoming increasingly unstable, and laundry workers like Marie Claire are beginning to sense that their world is about to change in ways they can't predict or control. The royal family's extravagant clothing expenses are becoming symbols of inequality that fuel revolutionary sentiment, and the workers who maintain these symbols may find themselves targets of violence from people who see them as collaborators with an oppressive system. Marie Claire's specialized knowledge of royal clothing care may become worthless or even dangerous if the political system that created the demand for these skills collapses. The irony of Marie Claire's position is that her intimate knowledge of royal life has given her no real understanding of the political forces that are about to destroy the world she knows. She understands the personal secrets and private habits of some of the most powerful people in Europe, but she has no insight into the economic and social trends that are making their lifestyle unsustainable. Her focus on the technical details of laundry work has prevented her from seeing the larger picture of a society in crisis, leaving her vulnerable to changes that will eliminate not just her job, but the entire social system that created it. Modern laundry workers who complain about working conditions, chemical exposure, or demanding schedules have no comprehension of how fortunate they are to work within systems that recognize their basic human rights and provide legal protections against the worst forms of exploitation. Marie Claire's experience reveals how essential workers can be simultaneously valued for their skills and treated as disposable when their knowledge becomes inconvenient or their services are no longer needed. The Royal Laundry of Versailles represents the ultimate expression of a system that prioritized appearance and status over human welfare, creating work environments that were dangerous, exploitative, and ultimately unsustainable. Marie Claire's story shows how even the most skilled and dedicated workers can be trapped in systems that use their labor to support lifestyles and institutions that are fundamentally unjust, and how the collapse of those systems can destroy not just the privileged classes they served, but also the working people whose lives depended on their continuation. Perhaps most tragically, Marie Claire's expertise in maintaining the clothing that symbolized royal power will become not just useless, but actually dangerous as France moves toward revolution. Her knowledge of royal secrets and her association with aristocratic privilege will make her a target for revolutionary justice, demonstrating how quickly essential workers can become scapegoats when the systems they serve become politically unacceptable. The skills that once made her valuable will become evidence of collaboration with an oppressive regime, showing how political change can transform professional expertise into personal liability overnight.